The restaurant was the kind of place where the silence is more expensive than the wine. All glass and cold steel, with waiters who moved like ghosts. It was my 75th birthday, and I'd have been happier with a burger and a ball game at home. But my daughter Sarah insisted. "We're celebrating you, Dad," she'd said, her voice bright and brittle over the phone. Now, sitting across from me, her smile was just as fragile. My son-in-law, Daniel, sat beside her, his hand resting proprietarily on her arm, his cufflinks catching the dim light. My own son, Michael, sat to my left, staring at his water glass as if it held the answers to the universe. I'm an old man. I know my hands. They're gnarled from a lifetime of woodworking, with calluses thicker than boot leather and a network of silvery scars from blades that slipped. Those hands built a business, Miller & Son Woodworks, from a dusty garage into a brand known throughout the state. Those hands also built this family, rocked my children to sleep, held my wife Martha's hand until the very end. Tonight, they felt heavy and useless, resting on the starched white tablecloth. "To Dad," Daniel said, raising his glass. His toast was smooth, full of words like legacy and vision that felt hollow in his mouth. He was a finance guy, sharp suits and sharper ambition. He'd taken over the business side of things after Martha passed, and Sarah, my Sarah, had followed his lead completely. Michael, the son in the company name, was relegated to managing the workshop floor, a role he seemed to shrink into a little more each year. The meal was a blur of polite questions and my own one-word answers. My chest was tight, a familiar ache I'd had since Martha was gone. It felt like a stone had settled right behind my ribs. Finally, after they'd brought out a single sad-looking slice of tiramisu with a candle flickering in it, Sarah reached into her expensive leather purse. She didn't pull out a gift. She pulled out a sheaf of papers, neatly bound in a blue folder. "Dad, we have one more thing," she said, her voice losing its forced cheer. She slid the folder across the table. It stopped just short of my plate. Daniel's eyes were on me, keen and unblinking. Michael refused to look up. I opened it. Legal jargon swam before my eyes. Limited liability, fiduciary transfer, legacy relinquishment. My throat went dry. I might be old, but I'm not a fool. They wanted me to sign away my remaining stake in the company. The 10% I'd kept not for the money, but for the name. For the right to walk into the workshop and still smell the cedar. To feel like I belonged. "It's a formality, Frank," Daniel said smoothly. "We're restructuring to secure a new line of credit. The bank needs a cleaner ownership profile. It's for the good of the company. My name is on the building," I said, my voice hoarse. Sarah's face hardened. That look, it was like seeing a stranger. "The bank doesn't care about sentiment, Dad. This is business." She pushed a pen across the table. "Just sign it. It's for your own good. It'll simplify things." I looked at Michael. He finally met my gaze, his eyes pleading. "Just do it, Dad. Don't make waves." I saw the shame in his posture, the way his shoulders slumped. My son, the one who was supposed to carry the torch. My hand trembled as I picked up the pen. The weight of it felt immense. I looked at the signature line, my name typed neatly beneath it. Francis Miller. I thought of Martha, of the promises we made. I thought of the sweat and splinters and the sheer joy of creating something real. And I thought of this cold, sterile room where my legacy was being erased with a slice of cake. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the center of the table like a lead weight. Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. "What do you mean, no, Dad? Don't be difficult." Daniel leaned forward, his voice a low hiss. "Frank, you need to understand. This is happening with or without your signature. Signing just makes it easier. Refusing, well, you'll regret it." The threat hung in the air, thick and choking. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pushed the folder back across the table, my hand steady now. "I'll need my lawyer to look at this." Sarah snatched the folder. Her face was a mask of fury. "There's nothing to look at. "You're being selfish," she hissed, her voice low enough that the other diners wouldn't hear. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. "Fine, have it your way." She turned and walked out, Daniel right behind her. Michael remained, frozen. He finally looked at me, his expression a miserable cocktail of guilt and fear. "Dad, you shouldn't have done that," he whispered, before getting up and hurrying after them, leaving me alone at the table with the flickering candle and a bill I knew would be astronomical. The silence they left behind was louder than any argument. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The drive home was quiet, the old truck a rumbling comfort in the dark. The smell of sawdust and turpentine clung to the upholstery, a scent that had been my life's perfume. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, scentless restaurant. When I got home, I didn't go into the house. I went to the workshop out back, my real home. I flipped on the overhead lights, and the familiar shapes of the saws, lathes, and sanders greeted me like old friends. This was my sanctuary, the place I built Miller & Son Woodworks, the place my son learned the trade at my knee, his small hands struggling to hold a chisel. Where had that boy gone? My fingers traced the grain on a half-finished rocking chair, the wood smooth as silk under my touch. The stone in my chest felt heavier than ever. Regret. It was a bitter taste in my mouth. Was it my fault? When Martha got sick, I'd poured myself into her care, letting the business drift. Daniel, so confident and full of spreadsheets, had stepped in. Sarah, always eager to prove she was as capable as any man, had been his fiercest advocate. I'd let them. I'd been too tired, too grief-stricken to fight. I thought I was securing their future. I never thought they'd try to erase my past. I spent the next 2 days in a fog. No calls from Sarah or Daniel. A single clipped text from Michael. "They're really mad, Dad. Please just reconsider." Reconsider? I'd spent hours poring over my copy of the original transfer agreement from 10 years ago when I'd made them majority partners. My lawyer at the time, a good man named Bill, had passed away a few years back. I remembered him insisting on something he called the legacy clause. It stated that as long as I maintained an active advisory role, my 10% share came with veto power on any sale or fundamental restructuring of the company. "A way to keep them honest, Frank," Bill had said with a wink. But what constituted an active advisory role? I hadn't drawn a salary in years. I'd offered advice, sure, but Daniel usually dismissed it as old-fashioned. My heart sank. They probably had me there. My involvement had been informal, a ghost in my own machine. On the third day, the quiet was broken by a knock on the front door. It wasn't my children. It was a woman in a crisp pantsuit, holding a clipboard. She had a kind, professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Miller?" she asked. "My name is Jessica Thorne. I'm from the County Adult Services Division. May I come in? We received a report of concern from your family." My blood ran cold. "A report of concern?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. My hand gripped the doorframe to steady myself. "Yes," she said, her gaze sweeping past me into the house. "Concerns about your ability to manage your personal and financial affairs independently, memory lapses, confusion, that sort of thing. This is just a preliminary assessment, completely routine." The humiliation hit me like a physical blow. It was Daniel's threat made real. "You'll regret it." This wasn't a business move anymore. This was an attack on my mind, on my very personhood. They were trying to paint me as incompetent, a senile old man who couldn't be trusted with his own decisions. My jaw clenched so hard I thought my teeth would crack. I wanted to slam the door in her face, to scream that this was a lie, a vicious, calculated lie. But I knew that would only make me look unstable, proving their point. With a heavy heart and trembling hands, I stepped aside. "Come in," I muttered, my throat constricting around the words. She walked past me, her sensible shoes clicking on the hardwood floors Martha had so lovingly polished. Her eyes were already cataloging everything, the stack of mail on the entryway table, the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. I felt like a bug under a microscope. She sat on my couch, the one where Martha and I had watched our children grow up, and opened her file. "Now, Mr. Miller," she began, her pen poised over a form. "Let's start with today's date. Can you tell me what it is?" Her question hung in the air, a simple thing made monstrous by its implication. I knew the date. Of course I knew the date. But in that moment, under her scrutinizing gaze, my mind felt like a traitor, threatening to go blank. The truth was, she wasn't the only visitor I was expecting. Just before she arrived, I'd gotten a call from an old friend, my lawyer James Peterson, son of my first lawyer Bill. He'd received a strange automated notification linked to my estate, something his father had set up years ago. He said he was on his way, and his voice had sounded urgent, grave. He told me not to sign anything, not to agree to anything until he got there. And as I opened my mouth to answer the assessor's simple question, I heard the sound of a car pulling into my driveway. The doorbell chimed, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the tense quiet in my living room. Jessica Thorne, the woman from Adult Services, paused with her pen in the air, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "Excuse me," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I rose from my armchair, my knees protesting, and walked to the door. Standing on my porch was James Peterson, a man I hadn't seen in 5 years. He was the spitting image of his father, Bill, but with a sharper suit and a worried frown that seemed etched into his brow. He was holding a slim leather briefcase. "Frank," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I came as soon as I could. I'm glad I caught you." His eyes flicked past me to the woman on my couch, and his frown deepened. "Am I interrupting something?" "This is Ms. Thorne," I said, a grim satisfaction rising in me. "She's here to assess my competence." James's jaw tightened. "I see. Well, Ms. Thorne, I am Francis Miller's legal counsel. I'll be sitting in on this assessment." He strode into the room without waiting for an invitation, his presence filling the space with an authority I hadn't felt since he'd walked in. He sat in the armchair opposite me, placing his briefcase on the floor beside him. "Please continue," he said to her, his tone leaving no room for argument. Ms. Thorne looked flustered. This was no longer a simple evaluation of a confused old man. She cleared her throat and tried to regain control. "As I was saying, Mr. Miller, your family has expressed concern, specifically your daughter, Sarah, and her husband, Daniel." "Did they now?" James murmured, his eyes sharp. "And what documentation did they provide to initiate this visit?" "A signed power of attorney granting Ms. Sarah Jennings medical and financial oversight," Ms. Thorne stated, consulting her file, "and a physician's letter recommending evaluation." The air left my lungs. Power of attorney. I never signed anything like that. My mind raced. When? How? Then a memory surfaced, hazy and unsettling. About 6 months ago, Daniel had stopped by with a thick stack of papers. "Annual corporate filings, Frank," he'd said, all breezy efficiency. "Just need your signature on a few pages. Standard stuff." I'd been in the middle of restaining the deck, my hands sore, my mind elsewhere. I'd trusted him. I'd scrawled my name where he'd pointed, my old eyes not bothering with the fine print. A hot wave of shame washed over me. I felt like a fool, an ancient, trusting fool. "I'd like to see that document," James said calmly. "Ms." Thorne hesitated, then pulled a photocopied document from her file and handed it to him. James studied it for a long moment. I watched his face, searching for a reaction. He was a good poker player, just like his father. He slid the paper across the coffee table to me. There it was. A durable power of attorney, comprehensive and ironclad, and at the bottom my signature, or a clumsy, shaky version of it. It looked like my signature on a bad day, but something was off. The loop on the F was too tight, the tail of the R too short. "I remember signing some papers for Daniel," I said, my voice thick. "Tax forms," he said. He was in a hurry. James nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving my face. "Frank, look at the date on this." I squinted. The date was from 3 weeks ago. On a day I was up at the lake fishing with my grandson, Leo. I have the receipt for the bait and gas in a jar on my kitchen counter. I couldn't possibly have signed it. They forged it. I breathed, the words tasting like poison. The betrayal was so profound, it was almost surreal. This wasn't just a business dispute anymore. This was a crime. They had manufactured a lie, created a false document to strip me of my rights, to have me declared unfit, all to get my last piece of the company. "And the physician's letter?" James asked Ms. Thorne, his voice like ice. "From a Dr. Evans," she replied, her own professional certainty beginning to waver. "Never heard of him," I grunted. James leaned back, a grim, calculating look on his face. "Frank, this is more serious than I thought. Ms. Thorne, I believe this assessment is concluded. Any further contact with my client will go through me. You are operating on the basis of fraudulent documents." Ms. Thorne, now looking deeply uncomfortable, quickly packed her things. "I will have to report this to my superiors, of course," she stammered, making a hasty retreat. The front door clicked shut behind her, leaving a profound silence in its wake. I slumped back into my chair, my head in my hands. The shaking had started again, a deep tremor that ran through my entire body. They forged my name, my own children. "Don't despair, Frank," James said, his voice cutting through my haze of misery. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick, dust-covered binder. It was my original corporate file, the one his father had created decades ago. "They've made a mistake. A big one. They're so focused on painting you as incompetent, they've forgotten what Bill and I put in place to protect you." He opened the binder to a tabbed section. "They've forgotten about the legacy clause, and they've forgotten about the one person who can verify your active advisory role for the last 10 years. My head snapped up. "Who?" James tapped a page. It was a list of private high-value clients. "They forgot about the man who handles the books for every single one of these accounts," he said. "The only other person who knows where the money really flows in that company. Your old accountant, David Henderson." My heart leapt. Henderson, of course. But then it sank just as quickly. "David retired 7 years ago, James. He lives in Florida now. Daniel hired a whole new firm." "I know," James said, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "I called him on my way over. He's flying in tomorrow morning, and he's bringing his private ledgers." The next 24 hours were the longest of my life. I paced the floors of my house, the silence pressing in on me. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like an accusation. How had I let this happen? How had I become a stranger to my own children, a target in my own life? I felt a burning anger, but underneath it was a deep, cold grief. The family Martha and I had built felt like a hollowed-out tree, still standing but dead on the inside. James had instructed me not to contact Sarah or Michael. "Let them think their plan is working," he'd said. "Let them get comfortable." The thought of their smug satisfaction made my stomach turn. The following afternoon, a rental car pulled into my driveway. James got out, followed by a stoop-shouldered man with a sun-weathered face and a shock of white hair. David Henderson. He looked older, thinner, but his eyes were as sharp as I remembered. He carried a worn leather satchel. "Frank," he said, his handshake firm. "It's been too long. Sorry it's under these circumstances." We sat around my kitchen table, the same table where I'd helped my kids with their homework. The air was thick with a nervous energy. James laid out the situation. The forged power of attorney, the fraudulent competency hearing, and their attempt to seize my remaining shares. David listened intently, his expression growing more grim with each word. When James was finished, David opened his satchel and pulled out not a dusty ledger but a slim laptop. He booted it up, his fingers moving surprisingly fast across the keyboard. "When I retired, Frank, I handed over all the official corporate accounts to Daniel's new people," he explained, his eyes on the screen. "But I never quite trusted that son-in-law of yours. Too slick. So I maintained a private encrypted mirror of the books for my own peace of mind," I told myself. He navigated to a series of password-protected files. Your active advisory role wasn't just offering opinions Daniel ignored. Don't you remember? My mind was a blank. What are you talking about, David? He turned the laptop toward me. On the screen was a spreadsheet, and the numbers were staggering. It was a detailed accounting of what he'd labeled the Founders Fund. For the past decade, whenever the company hit a rough patch, a cancelled contract, a spike in lumber prices, a payroll shortfall, I had quietly covered the difference. I'd pull from my personal savings, my retirement accounts, thinking of it as protecting the family legacy, protecting my children's future. I never took a note, never asked for repayment. I just gave. It wasn't advice, it was a lifeline. I had personally injected over $400,000 into the company over the years to keep it afloat, especially in the early days after Daniel took over. My God, I whispered, staring at the screen. The sheer scale of it. I'd never tallied it up. Each transaction was a memory. The time a supplier demanded cash up front, the winter they couldn't make the end-of-year bonuses. I had done it all so quietly they'd either forgotten or, worse, chosen to forget. This proves your role was more than advisory, James said, a note of triumph in his voice. It was essential. This activates the legacy clause in full. They can't restructure, they can't sell, they can't do a damn thing without your sign-off. We have them, Frank. A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me dizzy, but it was short-lived. There's more, David said, his voice grave. He clicked on another file. This is what they've been doing for the last 18 months. The new spreadsheet was an outflow chart. Under headings like DNS Consulting, Jennings Creative Holdings, and Global Strategy Partners, vast sums of money were being siphoned out of Miller & Son Woodworks. These were shell corporations. Daniel was bleeding the company dry, funneling the profits into his and Sarah's private accounts, all while preparing to sell the hollowed-out husk to a competitor. The new line of credit they wanted wasn't to invest in the business. It was to mask the insolvency long enough to close the sale. They weren't just trying to push me out. They were gutting my life's work. They were destroying the company to fund their lavish lifestyle. The rage I felt was cold and pure. We need to freeze their assets, James. We need to stop them now, I said, my voice shaking with fury. We will, James said. First thing in the morning. But there's one more thing we need. The original signed partnership agreement that contains the legacy clause. The copy in my father's file is just that, a copy. The notarized original is the only thing that's ironclad in court. Your copy should be in your safe deposit box at the bank, right? Of course. The box I'd shared with Martha. I hadn't opened it in years. It's there, I said, my heart starting to pound with a new dread. It's all there. The next morning, I stood before the polished steel wall of vaults at the downtown bank. The clerk, a young man with a bored expression, used his key, then mine. He slid out the long metal box and handed it to me, gesturing toward a private viewing room. My hands trembled as I carried it. Inside that box was my salvation. I sat down in the sterile, windowless room and lifted the heavy lid. On top lay Martha's jewelry and a stack of letters tied with a ribbon. Beneath them, our marriage license, the kids' birth certificates, the deed to the house. I pushed them aside, my fingers searching for the thick blue legal folder. But it wasn't there. My blood turned to ice. I frantically emptied the box, spreading the contents across the small table. It was gone. The folder, the one thing that could save me, was missing. And then I saw it. Tucked at the bottom of the box was a folded piece of paper I didn't recognize. A withdrawal slip. It noted the removal of one legal file. The signature at the bottom was clear and elegant, Sarah Jennings. The date was from the week before my birthday. She had been on the access list for the box since she was a teenager in case of emergency. She had planned this all along. She had taken my only weapon before she even started the war. Leaving the bank felt like walking out of my own tomb. The bright morning sun seemed to mock the darkness that had enveloped me. Sarah had the original document, my proof, my leverage, gone. James would have a copy, but a copy could be challenged in court, dismissed as outdated or superseded. The forgery, the embezzlement, it was my word, and David Henderson's mirrored files against my daughter and a mountain of official-looking paperwork she now controlled. It would be a long, ugly, and expensive fight. A fight I might not win. I drove straight to the workshop, the one place where the world still made sense. The smell of pine and oak was a balm to my frayed nerves. I sank onto a stool, the cold reality of my situation pressing down on me. I was 75 years old, and I was about to be locked in a legal battle with my own children, who had already outmaneuvered me at every turn. My shoulders, which had squared with righteous anger just yesterday, now felt heavy with the weight of utter defeat. My hands, idly tracing the rings on a block of maple, fell upon a set of carving tools. They were smaller, more delicate. Leo's, my grandson. He was 17, a quiet, thoughtful kid. He'd been spending more time here with me lately, ever since the tension in his own home had become a suffocating blanket. He had my hands, my love for the wood. He was a good boy, a better one than his father Michael had turned out to be. As if summoned by my thoughts, the workshop door creaked open. It was Leo. He had a worried look on his face. "Grandpa, are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft. "Mom and Dad had a huge fight last night. I heard them yelling your name. I couldn't bring myself to tell him the whole sordid story. Just some business disagreements, son," I mumbled. He didn't press. He walked over to a half-finished chess set he'd been carving. He picked up a knight, running his thumb over the intricate detail. "You know," he said, not looking at me. "Dad, he's not happy. I heard him on the phone with Aunt Sarah. He said she'd gone too far, that taking that folder from your bank box was wrong." My head shot up. "He said that? He knew she took it?" Leo nodded, finally meeting my eyes. His were full of a sad wisdom that no teenager should possess. He said he didn't want to be a part of it anymore. Aunt Sarah told him it was too late, that he was already an accomplice. So Michael knew. He knew, and he did nothing. The confirmation was a fresh twist of the knife, but Leo's words had also planted a seed. Michael was cracking. He was weak, yes, but perhaps not entirely without a conscience. "Leo," I said, my voice urgent. "There was something else in that box. A small red leather-bound book. Did they mention that?" I was grasping at straws. It was an old journal of Martha's. I hadn't even remembered it was in there. Leo's brow furrowed in thought. "No, but Dad was looking for something in the attic last night. He was pulling out all your old boxes. He seemed desperate." A sudden electrifying thought shot through me. What if there was another copy? Martha. She was always so meticulous, so careful. She'd never trusted Daniel, not really. She'd called him an empty suit. It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but it was all I had. "Leo, help me," I said, my voice trembling with a new energy. "We need to go through those boxes, the ones from your grandmother." For the next hour, we were a team. We hauled down dusty, forgotten boxes from the attic of my house. They were filled with a lifetime of memories. Old photographs, baby clothes, my honorable discharge from the army. My heart ached with nostalgia and grief. Then, in the bottom of a box labeled Household Receipts 1990-2000, we found it. It wasn't a copy of the partnership agreement. It was something far more powerful. It was a simple manila envelope. Inside was a notarized letter, dated just a few months before Martha passed away. Her handwriting, though a bit shaky, was unmistakable. Attached to it were photocopies of checks and bank statements. It was a complete record of every dollar I had ever put into the company from our personal accounts, each one meticulously documented by date, amount, and reason. Martha had been keeping her own ledger. The letter itself was addressed to me. "My dearest Frank," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you are in the trouble I always feared. Never let them tell you that you are just a silent partner. You are the foundation. This company was built on your back and funded by our dreams. This is your proof. Use it, and know that I am always with you." But there was one more thing tucked into the back of the envelope. It was a single, notarized addendum to the original partnership agreement. It was signed by me, by Michael, and by a third party. The addendum specified that the legacy clause could only be voided by the unanimous consent of all three signatories. The third signature wasn't Sarah's, it was Martha's. As my original partner before the kids were ever involved, she had retained a non-financial moral stake. Her signature was a permanent fixture. Sarah couldn't void the clause because she couldn't get a signature from a ghost. My eyes burned with tears. My wife, my Martha, had reached out from beyond the grave to protect me. Leo put a comforting hand on my shoulder. "What is it, Grandpa?" I held up the paper, my hand shaking not from age or fear, but from a profound, earth-shattering love. "It's a message from your grandmother," I whispered, "and it's the end of the line for your aunt and uncle." The air in James Peterson's conference room was thick enough to choke on. It was a large, mahogany-paneled room designed to project power and intimidation, and it was working. Sarah and Daniel sat on one side of the gleaming table, their own lawyer, a slick-looking man named Richards, beside them. They looked confident, smug even. They believed they held all the cards. They'd called this meeting, intending it to be the final nail in my coffin, a formal offer to buy out my nuisance shares for a pittance before they proceeded with the competency hearing. On the other side of the table sat myself, James, and David Henderson. To everyone's surprise, my son Michael had insisted on coming too. He sat slightly apart from us, his face pale and drawn, looking like a man being marched to his own execution. He wouldn't meet my eye. "Let's get straight to the point," Richards began, shuffling his papers. "Mr. Miller, my clients are prepared to offer you $25,000 for your 10% stake in the company. A generous offer, considering the company's current debt load and your lack of meaningful contribution for the past decade." Daniel smirked. Sarah watched me, her expression cold and unreadable. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment before I spoke. "Generous?" I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the table. "That's a funny word for it, especially since my lack of contribution seems to total around $412,000 in personal capital infusions over that same decade." David Henderson slid a folder across the table. "You'll find a full accounting in there," he said mildly. Richards opened it, his eyes scanning the first page. His professional composure cracked just for a second. He shot a furious look at Daniel, who paled. Sarah's eyes narrowed. "That's preposterous," she snapped. "Those were undocumented family loans, gifts." "Were they?" James countered smoothly. "Or were they capital contributions from an active advisory partner? Contributions that, according to the legacy clause in the original partnership agreement, solidify Mr. Miller's veto power over any sale or restructuring." Richard scoffed. "The legacy clause is a sentimental relic. We have the original agreement. We also have Mr. Miller's signed power of attorney." "A forged power of attorney," James cut in, his voice like steel. "Dated on a day my client was verifiably 200 miles away. We have receipts and a witness. Your clients have committed a felony." The color drained from Daniel's face. Sarah, however, held firm. "He's an old man. He's confused about the dates. And without the original partnership agreement, your claims about this clause are hearsay." She looked directly at me, a flicker of triumph in her eyes. She thought she had me. She thought the game was over. It was my turn. I reached into my own briefcase and pulled out the manila envelope Martha had left for me. My hands were perfectly steady. "You're right, Sarah. You do have an original agreement, the one I signed with you and Michael." I looked at my son, who flinched. "But you seem to have forgotten about the partner who came before you." I slid the notarized addendum across the table. "This is a binding addendum to that agreement. It stipulates that the legacy clause can only be nullified by the unanimous consent of the signatories, me, Michael, and my late wife, Martha Miller. A wave of confusion washed over their side of the table. Richards snatched the paper. He read it, then read it again, his face a mask of disbelief. This is highly irregular. Is it illegal? James asked pointedly. No, Richards admitted through gritted teeth. Sarah stared at the paper, then at me, her mouth opening and closing silently. She had built her entire plan on a document she didn't fully understand, a history she had chosen to ignore. So you see, I said, my voice gaining strength, you can't sell my company, you can't restructure it, and you can't get rid of me. Not without my signature, and not without a signature from Martha. I suggest you go find a medium. The silence that followed was absolute. Daniel looked like he was going to be sick, but I wasn't finished. I pulled out the letter from the envelope. Martha's letter. But before we discuss the fraudulent documents and the shell corporations you've been using to embezzle funds, I said, my eyes locking on Sarah, I think you should hear this. It's from your mother. I began to read. I read Martha's words of love and fear, her observations about Daniel's corrosive ambition, and her worries about Sarah's hardening heart. It wasn't a legal document. It was a mother's final, heartbreaking plea to her children to choose kindness over greed, family over fortune. By the time I finished, my own voice was thick with emotion. I looked up. Daniel was staring at the table, his face ashen. Michael was openly weeping, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. But it was Sarah's reaction that struck me to the core. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, her mask of cold fury finally, completely shattered. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the empty chair beside her, as if she could see her mother sitting there. James cleared his throat, bringing the room back to the present. So, he said, his voice soft but firm, I believe my client has a proposal for you. The proposal I laid out was simple, and it wasn't the one they expected. I didn't want the company back. I didn't want to press felony charges for the forgery. I didn't want a long, drawn-out war that would enrich only the lawyers. Staring at my children's broken faces, all the rage had evaporated from my heart, leaving behind only a profound, aching sadness. Martha's letter had reminded me that vengeance was a hollow prize. What I wanted was justice and peace. Here's the deal, I said, my voice steady. You're going to buy me out. Not for $25,000. You're going to pay me the full audited market value of my 10% share. And you're also going to repay me every last cent of the $412,000 I put in over the years, which we will now officially classify as a loan with interest. Daniel's head snapped up. We don't have that kind of money. The company is leveraged to the hilt. That sounds like your problem, not mine, I replied calmly. Sell your new boat. Sell that ridiculous sports car you drive. Sell the shell corporations you've been funding with my legacy. I don't care how you get it. You will have a certified check on my lawyer's desk in 30 days. In return, I will sign over my shares, I will dissolve the legacy clause, and I will not pursue criminal charges. I paused, letting the weight of the offer settle. This is a one-time offer. You don't take it, and we file our lawsuit tomorrow morning. Michael, his face blotchy and tear-stained, looked at Sarah. We have to do it, Sarah, he whispered. It's the only way. It's what we owe him. For the first time, Sarah didn't argue. She just gave a single stiff nod, her eyes still fixed on that empty space where her mother's memory lingered. The fight was gone. A month later, the check cleared. It was a staggering amount, enough to ensure I would never have to worry about money again. But it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the principle. It was the ledger being balanced, not just financially, but morally. Daniel and Sarah had to liquidate nearly everything they had acquired to make the payment. They kept the company, but they were starting over, humbled and heavily in debt. The poetic justice wasn't in their ruin, but in their forced return to the hard work and struggle that I had once endured to build the business in the first place. I didn't see them for a long time after that. The silence was a welcome relief. I sold the big family house, which held too many ghosts, and bought a smaller place with a large detached garage that I converted into the workshop of my dreams. That's where I am now. The scent of fresh-cut maple is in the air. My grandson, Leo, is here with me, just as he is most afternoons. He's sanding a beautiful cedar chest, his movements careful and precise. The quiet bond between us is the true inheritance, the real legacy. Last week, Michael called. It was the first time. He sounded different, quieter, more thoughtful. He apologized, a real heartfelt apology that I believe was genuine. He said Sarah was in therapy. He asked if maybe he and Leo could come over for dinner sometime. I told him I'd think about it. Forgiveness is a journey, not a switch you can flip. My life is smaller now, but it's more peaceful. I am not a CEO or a patriarch anymore. I am just a carpenter, a grandfather. I am a man who, when faced with betrayal, found the strength to demand respect, not revenge. My legacy isn't a company name etched on a building. It's in the quiet dignity I reclaimed. It's in the calloused hands that still know how to create. And it's in the heavy old key to this workshop that I just placed in my grandson's hand. A key he has earned.